You can actually take your phones as long as you're using Twitter or Instagram to talk about my talk. That's okay. That's all right. So what do we think about when we think about distraction? What distracts us most? Give me some examples. Your phone. What else? Your email. Slack. Yeah, that comes up a lot. Other people. Fantastic. All right, so we're going to talk about some of this stuff. When it comes to some of the tech products that we've mentioned, Slack, Instagram, email, all these products, part of the reason why we find so many of these products distracting is because of this. This is called the hook model. And if you've read my first book, Hooked, you might be familiar with it. I published it about 5 years ago. And I popularized this model to help folks understand why is it that so many of our products and services are so engaging, so habit-forming. So in order to understand how this hooked model works, let me walk you through this very quickly with an example for a product that you might use quite often, maybe Facebook or Instagram, Slack. All of these products and services display the hook model. Every hook starts with a trigger. A trigger is some kind of call to action. Usually it's in the form of an external trigger, a ping, a ding, a ring, or an internal trigger, some kind of call to action that comes from within you. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So when you get that notification from Facebook or Instagram or whatever, you're prompted to take a simple action. It can be something as easy as scrolling the feed, pushing the play button on YouTube, a quick Google search, the simplest action done in anticipation of a reward. Next comes the reward, which tends to be in the form of a variable reward. If you've heard about intermittent reinforcements, B.F. Skinner, that slot machine effect, pulling on a slot machine keeps you engaged because of the variability, the uncertainty, and that pulling on a slot machine uses the same exact psychology as scrolling a feed. Then you've got the final and probably the most overlooked of the 4 steps of the hook model, the investment phase. And this is where we put something into the product to store value in it. So the more we use the product, the better and better it becomes. And this is revolutionary. This is really what makes interactive products and services so amazingly valuable, is that unlike a tooled product like a Model T, like not a Model T, like the Tesla, I used to use the Model T in my previous talk, like a product that you have to tool in a factory. It takes a long time to change and customize the product. It's very hard to do, very expensive to do. Well, many of the products that we use every day are customized for us based on our investment of data, content, reputation. All of these things improve the product with use so that it increases the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. So that's the very high 30,000-foot view of the hooked model. There's a lot more about it in my book, Hooked, which came out about 5 years ago. And the reason I wrote this book was not for the big distracting tech companies that we think today. I didn't write this book for Facebook. I didn't write it for YouTube. I didn't write it for the gaming companies. They taught me these techniques. They are the case studies within the book. The reason I wrote the book was to democratize these techniques for the rest of us, so that all of us can make products and services habit-forming and engaging and make the kind of products and services that people want to use as opposed to feeling like they have to use. And that's exactly what's happened over the past 5 years. Companies like Kahoot. Does anybody have school-age kids? Chances are that your kid has used Kahoot. It's the world's largest educational software. And they have this mission of hooking kids to education in the classroom. Companies like Byte Foods gets people to change their eating habits. Fitbod helps people get hooked to exercising in the gym. And that's exactly what my mission was with writing this book. But there's a dark side. And the dark side is of these products that are designed so well that they create these habits within us, is that sometimes we overuse them. And so in my case, I remember a few years ago, when I was sitting with my daughter, we had this afternoon planned together, where we had this full afternoon of daddy-daughter time. And I remember we had this book called Daddy and Me, and one of the activities in the book was to ask each other this question. If you could have any superpower, what superpower would you want? And I remember the question verbatim, but I can't tell you what my daughter said. Because when she was answering me, I was responding, just one sec here, I just had something I needed to do for work here real quick. And she got the message that whatever was on my phone was more important than she was. And by the time I looked up from my phone, she'd left the room to go play with some toy outside. And if I'm really honest with you, this didn't happen just once. It happened multiple times. Not only with my daughter, it happened with my friends. It would happen when I'd sit down at my desk to do some work and that I knew I needed to do right then, and yet I'd still get distracted. And so if you asked me today what superpower I would want, I would tell you that I would want the power to be indistractable. Becoming indistractable will be the skill of the century. When we think about the kind of jobs that can't be automated away, it's the kind of jobs that require human creativity that only comes from discrete concentration and focus. When we think about relationships, psychologists tell us that loneliness is as detrimental to our health as obesity and smoking. And what kind of example are we setting for our kids when what they see of mommy and daddy is the top of their heads as we're scrolling away on our devices? So, how do we deal with this problem of distraction? How do we get the best of technology without letting it get the best of us? Well, we should know, some people will tell you that the problem is the technology, right? The technology is doing it to us. And I take some issues with that. First and foremost, we know that distraction is not a new problem. Plato talked about the nature of Akrasia, this tendency that we all have to do things against our better interests, and that was 2,500 years ago. People have always been getting distracted. Facebook and the iPhone did not invent distraction. So how do we deal with this very ancient human problem of getting distracted? Well, the first thing we need to do is to define what we mean by distraction. So the opposite of distraction, if you ask most people, is focus. But it's not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. Both words come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And you'll notice both words end in the same 6-letter word, action. So traction is any action that pulls you towards what you want to do, things that you plan to do with intent. Now, this is very important because this frees us from this ridiculous moral hierarchy that somehow what you do with your time is inferior to what I do with my time, right? You playing Candy Crush or checking Facebook, that's somehow morally inferior to my 3 hours of watching NFL football, right? There is no difference. They're both pastimes and they're both great as long as they're done with intent. Then we have distraction. The opposite of traction is distraction, any action we take that pulls us away from what we plan to do. Now, this is really important because for many of us, distraction tricks us constantly. Right? See if this ever happens to you. This used to happen to me all the time. I'd sit down at my desk and I'd say, okay, now I'm going to do that big project. I'm going to finish that presentation. I'm going to do that report. I'm going to do the thing I've been planning to do that I've been putting off. Right after I check email. Right after I look at that Slack channel real quick. Right after I just check up on the news. And so we do what's called pseudo work because we think it's what we should be doing. But if it's not what we plan to do with our time, it is just as much of a pernicious distraction. So what leads us to either traction or distraction? Two things. The first are what we call external triggers. External triggers, again, are these pings, dings, and rings, these things in our environment that prompt us to either traction or distraction. If an external trigger tells you, hey, it's time to go to the gym, it's time for that meeting, it's time for that thing you plan to do, wonderful, it's moving you towards traction. But if you're with your daughter and you plan to spend quality time with her and your phone rings and now you're with your device as opposed to being fully present with someone you love very much, well, now it's moved you towards distraction. But what turns out to be the most common source of distraction is not these pings and dings and devices that we all think about as the source of distraction. The most common form of distraction are not the external triggers, but in fact they are the internal triggers. Internal triggers are these uncomfortable psychological states that we seek to escape. So if we want to answer this ancient question of why do we do things against our better interest, we actually have to go a layer deeper to understand why do we do anything and everything? And if you ask most people what's the nature of human motivation, they'll give you some version of carrots and sticks, right? That everything we do is about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. This is called Freud's pleasure principle. Unfortunately, neurologically speaking, that ain't true. That in fact, we do not do things for the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Everything we do for one reason, and that is the avoidance of discomfort. It's pain all the way down. We know this to be true from a physiological perspective, right? If you go outside and it's cold, that's uncomfortable. That doesn't feel good. So what do? We put on a coat, right? If we come back inside, now it's too hot. That doesn't feel good. We take it off. If we feel hunger pangs, that's not comfortable. We eat. And when we're stuffed, that's not comfortable either. We stop eating. So those are physiological responses. And the same truth occurs with psychological sensations. So let me ask you, what app or website do we go to when we're feeling lonely? Where do people go? Where do you go? Facebook. Somebody said Tinder? Also, different kind of loneliness, but also true. What about uncertainty? Before you scan your brain to see if you know the answer to something, what are you doing? You Google it. And what about when you're feeling bored, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, you have that big project you don't want to work on right now, where do you go?
Netflix.
You check Netflix. Thanks, Gib. We check Netflix, we check stock prices, sports scores, the news, ESPN, all of these things cater to this uncomfortable sensation of boredom. We don't like that sensation, and the solution to that discomfort is found with a website or an app in our pockets. So that means if we are going to conquer distraction, what we have to start with is this fundamental truth that our distractions start, like any of our behaviors, with these internal triggers, with these uncomfortable emotional states, and we have to understand the discomfort that we are trying to escape. That fundamentally, if we don't deal with this fact, that all of our distractions originate from these internal triggers, we will always become distracted by something. So if we understand that all behavior is spurred by a desire to escape discomfort, that means that time management is pain management. Time management is pain management. So what does that mean? How do we fix this problem? Well, we only have two choices. We can either fix the source of the problem, figure out what it is that we are trying to escape from, and actually deal with that issue, or we have to learn tactics to cope with these uncomfortable sensations. So unfortunately, I don't have a ton of time today, but I want to give you just a few tips, a few quick hits that you can use today to help you cope with that discomfort. There's a lot more in the book, but let me just give you a few tactics that I use every day. Psychologists tell us that in order to manage this discomfort that leads to distraction, one of the most effective things we can do is to simply note the sensation. That simply writing down what it is we're feeling has a very powerful impact because it gives us greater agency and control over that sensation. It no longer becomes a mindless behavior. It's something that we can start to become a little mindful around. So just writing down that sensation. Now, what you do next is critical. What most people do when they experience these uncomfortable emotional states, if they don't immediately reach for that distraction to not feel that state, is that they start getting contemptuous. And they do this in two categories, either the blamers or the shamers. The blamers say, ugh, it's Slack doing it to me. It's email. It's this darn iPhone. It's Facebook. Those are the blamers. The shamers, this is what I used to do, the shamers say, man, I must not be cut out for this. I'm not very good at this job. There's something wrong with me. I must have a disorder or an addictive personality or I'm lazy. And those are the shamers. And neither of these two approaches serve us very well. Instead of being contemptuous, we want to be curious. Simply noting that sensation and exploring it. The same way we would talk to a friend who was struggling with that feeling. Just simply noting what that sensation is. Then we can use a technique called the 10-minute rule to surf the urge. This comes from acceptance and commitment therapy, and psychologists tell us that simply allowing ourselves a bit of space to feel that sensation for a few minutes can help us stay on track. What you don't want to do is to strictly abstain from that behavior. Abstinence, it turns out, oftentimes can backfire. For example, I want you all right now, nobody in the room, no matter what you do, don't think of a white bear. Okay? You're all thinking the white bear, of course. And actually, there was a study that found exactly this fact, that when we try and strictly restrict ourselves, we oftentimes we bounce back with a vengeance. And this can train us to get into the habit of turning to that behavior for relief. So instead of strict abstinence, we say, I can give into that temptation, whether that temptation is a piece of chocolate cake or checking your Slack channel when you really want to focus. We can give into that temptation in 10 minutes. And sometimes I'll just literally take out my phone, say, set the timer for 10 minutes, and I have two choices. I can either get back to the task at hand or simply note that sensation, explore it with curiosity rather than contempt, and you'll find 99% of the time you'll get back to the task at hand before that 10-minute timer goes off. The next step to becoming indistractable is to make time for traction. Now, when I did the research for Indistractable, I met with a lot of folks who told me how distracting the world is today. And did you see what Donald Trump tweeted? And my boss wants this, and the Slack channel, this is happening here, and my kids are texting me, and I can't get anything done because there's so much happening, right? I'm constantly distracted. And to one of my friends, I said, can I see what it was that you planned to do today? What did you get distracted from? And she kind of sheepishly took out her phone, and she showed me her calendar app, and there was like a dentist appointment on her calendar. There wasn't much of anything on there. And so here's the thing. We can't call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. If your day is full of white space, and I know we have many CEOs and executives here, I know you already probably do this, but two-thirds of Americans don't keep any sort of a calendar. And the one-third who do, most of them don't do it correctly, which is, this is going to scare you, okay, brace yourselves. This is called a time box calendar. And this is the kind of schedule that we have to start keeping. Because when we have swaths of white space in our day, we know what we're going to do with that time. We're going to impulsively check email. We're going to impulsively do the things that we didn't really want to do. So the idea here, by keeping a time box calendar, by the way, this isn't some pet technique. This has been researched for over 40 years. This technique is called making an implementation intention. Thousands of studies have found this is one of the most effective ways to make sure you do what it is you say you're going to do, is to simply plan ahead. And this is called turning your values into time. I used to constantly talk a good game. I would say, okay, what are my values? Well, I want to I want to take care of my body. That's important to me. My health is important. Spending time with my family, with my friends, those are my values. But if you looked at my calendar, that wouldn't be reflected there. And so now, part of what we have to do is to start turning our values into time to make sure that we can make time for the things that are most important to us by holding a place for them on our schedule. Now, this can revolutionize your life, not only in the work life, but also at home. So there's a technique I talk about in the book called schedule syncing. Schedule syncing is when we sit down with the stakeholders in our life, the people who we owe time to, and we simply synchronize this schedule. So at work, we might sit down with our colleagues, if it's our boss, our manager, and we say, okay, here's all the things you asked me to do this week, right? All the output of my time. Now, how do you think I should allocate that time? Here's my schedule. Here's what I think I'm going to do for the week. But there's all this stuff I couldn't fit in. Help me reprioritize what you don't want me to get done this week. We can also do the same in our domestic responsibilities. So in my household, my wife and I have been married for almost 18 years now. And we would have this constant disagreement in our household around our unequal share of household responsibilities, right? And it turns out I wasn't alone. I'm embarrassed to admit this to you, but this will be no surprise to at least half the room, that in heterosexual dual-income households, women take a disproportionate share of household administrative duties, okay, across the board. This has been well studied. But I didn't think this was happening in my household at all. I was very wrong. And I would constantly tell my wife, look, if you want me to do something, if I didn't do something, if it's taking out the trash or doing the laundry or whatever, just tell me to do it. I'll do it. But what I didn't realize is that by asking her to remind me, that was itself work, right? I see a lot of women's heads nodding, and no men are agreeing with me here. And so what did we do about this? Well, we made a time box schedule. We sat down together. We put down all our household responsibilities down, and we decided to split those equitably because that's one of my values, is to have an equitable marriage. And then the critical step was to actually put that time on our calendars, because there's so many contingencies of, if she doesn't do this, then I can't do the next task. If I don't make the vegetables for the week, then she can't have them ready for dinner, etc. So just having a weekly schedule sync with your boss, with your domestic partner, with your kids, can work wonders for making sure you live out your values and do what it is you say you're going to do, and make sure you don't get distracted. Now, the few other quick tips for making time for traction is to plan the time, not the output. We've been told in the productivity community that if you just write down your to-dos, they'll all magically get done. And we know that's not true, right? I used to recycle about half of my to-do list day after day after day because I didn't put those to-dos on my schedule. Then what we want to do is to get rid of low-value work. A Harvard Business Review study found that about 1 day out of every 5-day work week for the average knowledge worker is spent doing low-value tasks. Tasks that you need to do, but could have been done by someone or something else. And the beauty of the age we live in is that we can use these technologies to do this low-value work. For example, this horrible ping pong game that we play, this email ping pong game of trying to coordinate meetings. Well, there are companies like X.AI that will use artificial intelligence to do all that for you, just like a virtual assistant will do for you, an admin assistant, but it's all done with artificial intelligence. So get rid of that low-value work. And then finally, what we need to do is to spend less time communicating and more time concentrating. The average knowledge worker, after emails and meetings, after just those two tasks of responding to emails and attending meetings, is left with, on average, an hour and a half in every day to do everything else they have to do. Well, if our work output as knowledge workers, whether you're a designer, an engineer, whatever, it doesn't matter, your output is one thing. Your output is novel solutions to hard problems. That's what we do for a living. But you can't generate novel solutions to hard problems without time in your day to focus, to think. Concentration, time to work through these problems and strategize is a huge competitive advantage, and it should be in our calendar as well. Now, part of the reason that all this communicating is so distracting is that it comes coupled with these external triggers, these pings, these dings, these rings that come coupled with the Slack channels, the emails, et cetera. Now, there's actually one profession where these external triggers are literally a matter of life and death. If I were to ask you, what are the 3 leading causes of death in the United States? I'll tell you the first 2. Number 1 is heart disease. Number 2 is cancer. What's the 3rd leading cause of death? Don't answer if you've read my book, Gib. What's the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States? What do you think? We'll take some guesses. Traffic accidents. What else? Depression, stroke, Alzheimer's. Not even close. Not even close. If it was a disease, the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States of America would be medical errors. Medical errors. Just show of hands, has anybody experienced this themselves or in their family? Across the board, look at the room. You won't believe this. Every talk I give, somebody in the crowd has been affected by this problem. Estimates range that about 200,000 Americans every year are harmed when medical professionals give patients the wrong medication inside the hospital. This is a 100% preventable human error. Recently, a brave group of nurses at UCSF decided to tackle this problem. They wanted to figure out what was really going on. And they discovered that the source of the problem was distraction. That when nurses were dosing out medication, they were interrupted on average 10 times per dosing round. And so they decided to figure out how they could fix this problem. Interestingly enough, the metaphor here in our work, right, is that these nurses didn't realize they were making the mistakes until it was too late. They thought they were doing a great job. It wasn't until someone was harmed that they realized they had made a mistake. And this, of course, happens to us every day. We think we're doing a great job, right? We think our work output is fantastic. And we don't realize that we're doing good work despite the fact that we're constantly distracted, and we could do so much better if we worked in a focused manner. So what did these nurses do? They found a solution to this problem that reduced prescription mistakes by 88%. 88% reduction in this problem. And the answer was not some fancy new technology. It wasn't some multi-million-dollar program. It was plastic vests. Cheap plastic vests that the nurses wore that told their colleagues, drug round in progress, do not disturb. Right? I need to concentrate right now, or there are going to be some negative repercussions. And so what can we learn from this? How can we adopt this practice as well? Well, what about something like this? Right? Many of us work in open floor plan offices. They have a lot of benefits, primarily that they save companies a ton of money because you don't have to give everyone an office. But the problem with open floor plan offices is that they are hotbeds of distraction. So if we made it a cultural norm that when you need to focus, when you need to think, you put this little screen sign. This comes in my book, Indistractable. You pull it out. It's a piece of cardstock. You fold it into thirds, and you put it on your computer monitor. And if you don't want to buy the book because you're cheap, I understand. You're startup people. You can download it on my website, and I'll give you a link at the end where you can actually print this out for yourself and give it to your employees. So this is a great way to hack back these distractions. You know, not all distractions, not all these external triggers originate from our technology. They can originate from other people as well. We can use our tech to hack back external triggers. So for example, this amazing function that few people use on their iPhone, do not disturb while driving mode. This is how it works. You turn on do not disturb while driving, and if anyone calls or texts you, during that time when you have Do Not Disturb while driving on, they get an automatic reply that says, I can't talk right now, but if this is urgent, text me with the word urgent, and the message will come through. And you don't have to use this just when you're driving. You can customize that message to say, I'm indistractable at the moment. If it's urgent, text me with the word urgent, and then that message will come through. Here's another way that we can hack back external triggers. How many of our laptops look like this? We don't have to live like this, right? Psychologists tell us that all of these external triggers take a tax, take a toll on our focus, on our ability to concentrate. We can get rid of all those files. Here's my advice. Take all those files, put them in one folder called Everything, and search for them later. On our phones as well, we don't need all of these external triggers constantly pinging and dinging us. 2/3 of people with the smartphones, 2/3 of people with a smartphone never change their notification settings. Can we really say technology is hijacking our brains, that we're getting addicted to technology when we haven't taken a few minutes to turn off the notifications that don't serve us? This is kindergarten stuff. This is easy to do. We can have the kind of environment, works environment on our phones that don't lead to so much distraction. So the idea here is to hack back these external triggers by asking ourselves this critical question. This is kind of my Marie Kondo moment. This critical question of, is the trigger serving me, or am I serving it? Is it leading me towards something I want to do, an act of traction, something I plan to do, or is it taking me off track? It's leading to distraction. Then what we want to do is, of course, adjust those notification settings. And a little bit controversial here, it's time we start leaving these devices outside of meetings. That when we have a corporate meeting, if we decide it's important enough to meet in the physical world, we have to leave these devices outside. One laptop per meeting. And that laptop should be projecting what people are recording, their contributions, so everyone knows they're being heard. But here's what happens when we start using devices in meetings. When somebody takes out their phone and thinks it's a good time to check email, it's like a smoker lighting a cigarette in front of other smokers. Everybody starts thinking, I probably have some emails waiting for me too. And those internal triggers start bubbling up, and now we all want to start checking our devices. So if we are going to meet in the physical world, we need to be present both in body and mind. And finally, the last step to becoming indistractable is to prevent distraction with pacts. A pact is a pre-commitment. It's something that we do now to make sure we don't get distracted later on. Now, if there's one mantra I want you to remember from my talk, it's that the antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. The time to make a decision is not when you need a lot of willpower and self-control. It's too late. If the chocolate cake is on its way to your mouth, if the cigarette is lit and you're about to take a puff, if you're sleeping next to your cell phone, they're going to get you, right? Of course they're going to get you. The time to make that decision is ahead of time. The antidote to impulsiveness is forethought. So the first recorded case of a pre-commitment comes to us from the story of Ulysses in the Odyssey, 2,500 years ago. Homer wrote the story of this hero who has to sail his ship home safely. But on his path, he needs to pass by the island of the Sirens. The Sirens are these mythical creatures that sing this magical song, and anyone who hears this song crashes their ship onto the island of the Sirens, where they die. Now, Ulysses knows this is going to happen, so he plans ahead. He tells his crew to put wax inside their ears, and he tells them to bind him to the mast of the ship, and he says, no matter what I do, no matter what I say, don't let me go. And it works. He's able to sail his ship right past the island of the Sirens and safely return his ship and crew home. So what can we learn from this? How can we use the same lesson of a pre-commitment? Well, we can use tech to block out tech distraction. On my desktop, I use this app called Self-Control that blocks out certain websites when I'm doing my focused work. I use this app Forest every single day. Here's how Forest works. You take out the app, you dial in how much time you want to do focused work for, and as soon as you click go, a little virtual tree is planted. Now, if you pick up your phone and you do anything with it, the virtual tree dies. And you don't want to be a virtual tree murderer. So you stay on task, right? So it's a pre-commitment. It's a promise to yourself that you've made. You can also find a focus friend, right? It used to be in our parents' generation, when they went into the office, if they started reading Vogue or ESPN at their or Sports Illustrated at their desk, people would see that they're not on task. But today, I can be hunched over my machine, and I'm checking ESPN, and it looks like I'm following up on sales leads or something. So by asking a friend to sit with you, to have focused work time together, this is a pre-commitment. This is a contract you're making with your buddy to make sure you stay on task. Now, if you say to yourself, yeah, I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with finding someone at work, or I work remotely, no problem. Technology to the rescue. There's a website called focusmate.com. Full disclosure, I'm an investor in this company because I loved it so much. Focusmate.com is like chat roulette. Remember chat roulette? But without all the nasty parts? So the way this works, if you're the kind of person, this is particularly helpful if you find it difficult to get started in the morning. First thing you say, okay, 9 a.m., I want to get to my desk and start doing that hard project. Well, what you do is in advance, you sign up for a time slot with your focus mate. At that time, they'll be waiting for you. And you'll see them on a little video when you use the website. This was a student, a medical school student in the Czech Republic. We say, okay, hi, how you doing? Go. Okay, 30 seconds later, you're working. And it's unbelievable how this little promise that you're making with another person to do focused work at the same time, how wonderful of a pact this is to keep you on task. So the idea here is to reduce distraction with pacts by using tech to block out tech. But there's one word of warning here, that this technique can backfire. That you have to use this technique after you've done the other three. This technique can be dangerous, okay? It's only after you've mastered the internal triggers, made time for traction, hacked back those external triggers, that's when this technique is helpful. And for some people, an extra word of warning, some people, when they use this technique, they find that when they fail, as we all invariably will on the path to becoming indistractable, some people find it very difficult to get back on track. And the difference between those who can succeed and keep trying and those who fail and can never get back on track is one thing, and that turns out to be self-compassion. That people who have more self-compassion, psychologists tell us, are much more likely to achieve their long-term goals. So how do we cultivate self-compassion? The way we cultivate self-compassion is to talk to ourselves the way we would talk to a good friend. So if I told you about that time when I was with my daughter and I'd failed her, if you were my friend, would you tell me that I'm a horrible human being, that I'm a terrible father? I hope not. And yet, I used to talk to myself this way all the time. I would beat myself up. And you know what? It wasn't helpful. And here's what else isn't helpful. This idea that technology is hijacking our brains, that it's addicting all of us, that there's nothing we can do about it. That is also not helpful, and it's not true, because it leads to this state of learned helplessness, this phenomenon that when someone feels they don't have agency, they don't fix the problem. But there's so much we can do. We can master these internal triggers. We can make time for traction. We can hack back the external triggers, and we can prevent distraction with pacts. So the message I want to leave with you today is that we can do this. You know, recently I sat down with my daughter when I was finishing up my book. It was just published last week. And I asked her, and I said, I didn't hear what you said the first time I asked you this question, but I'm really curious, what superpower would you want? And here's what she said, honest to God. I thought she was going to say fly like Superman or webs like Spider-Man or something. Here's what she said. This is exactly what she said. She said that she would want the power to always be kind. That's what she said, honest to goodness. So after drying my tears, I kind of thought about it for a minute, and I realized that all of us have the power to be kind, don't we? We don't have to be born on some alien planet or get bit by a radioactive spider. Anyone can be kind. And the same is true when it comes to managing distraction. We can get the best out of our tools without letting them get the best of us. We can all become indistractable. Thank you very much. Thank you.